The day I learned that the person I trusted most was hiding something from me was the day I almost walked away from the woman I planned to marry. My name is Ethan Parker, and until that evening, I believed I knew exactly what my future looked like. I had spent 3 years building a life with Olivia Bennett, and every decision we made was about the family we hoped to create together. We had chosen a wedding date, looked at venues, and spent countless nights talking about the little details that would turn a celebration into a memory. I thought I knew Olivia better than anyone. That belief started to change on a quiet Saturday afternoon when I arrived at her parents' house earlier than expected. I wanted to surprise her before our dinner plans. Olivia had mentioned that she would be helping her parents prepare some things for the weekend, and I thought showing up with her favorite coffee would make her smile. When I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed normal. The familiar white fence surrounded the yard. The flowers near the front porch were blooming, and the house looked exactly as it had every other time I visited. I walked toward the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee and feeling excited about seeing her. I still remember how peaceful I felt in that moment because only a few minutes later, everything I thought I knew would be questioned. I knocked, but no one answered immediately. Since I had visited many times before, I stepped inside after hearing voices from the living room. I was about to call out Olivia's name when I heard her talking with her parents. At first, I smiled because I thought they were discussing wedding plans. Then I heard my name. I stopped moving. Olivia's voice sounded serious, not happy or excited. Her father said something I could not hear clearly, and then Olivia replied, "He cannot know yet. Not until we are completely sure." My hand tightened around the coffee cup. Those words felt heavier than they should have. What did she mean I could not know? Why were they discussing something about me without telling me? I stood quietly near the hallway, trying to understand what I was hearing. I did not want to listen, but my curiosity and confusion kept me there. I heard Olivia's mother ask whether waiting was the right decision. Olivia answered softly, "I just do not want him to get hurt before we have everything ready." That sentence should have comforted me, but instead it created even more questions. Hurt by what? Ready for what? My mind immediately began searching for answers, and unfortunately, it found the ones I feared most. I thought about the recent moments when Olivia seemed distracted. I remembered times when she ended phone calls quickly or changed the subject when I asked if everything was okay. At the time, I believed she was simply stressed about the wedding. Standing there in that hallway, those small moments suddenly felt like pieces of a different story. A story where I was the only person who did not know the truth. I looked down at the coffee cups in my hands and felt a strange emptiness replace the excitement I had carried when I arrived. I had come to surprise the woman I loved. Instead, I was standing inside her parents' home wondering if my entire future was built on something I did not understand. I slowly placed the coffee cups on the small table near the entrance and took a step back. I wanted to leave before anyone saw me. I wanted to pretend I never heard anything. But then Olivia's father spoke again, and one sentence stopped me completely. "Olivia, he deserves to know the truth soon." The sentence my future father-in-law spoke stayed in my mind long after I stepped away from the hallway. He deserves to know the truth soon. I stood near the front door, holding on to those words while my thoughts raced in every possible direction. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but every question I had been ignoring suddenly became impossible to avoid. I quietly walked outside and sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. The coffee I had brought for Olivia was still sitting on the small table near the entrance, untouched. I had arrived at her parents' home feeling excited, but I was leaving with a feeling I could not describe. It was not anger yet. It was confusion mixed with disappointment. I kept asking myself the same question: what truth could possibly involve me but remain hidden until now? I thought about calling Olivia immediately, but my hand stopped every time I reached for my phone. I wanted answers, but I was afraid of what those answers might be. Instead, I decided to wait a little longer. I told myself I needed to understand the entire conversation before making a decision that could change everything. After a few minutes, I saw Olivia walk through the front door with her parents. They were still talking quietly, unaware that I had been there. I watched as Olivia smiled at something her mother said, and that small moment confused me even more. She looked like the same woman I had loved for years. She did not look like someone hiding a secret that would destroy our future. I drove home slowly, replaying every word I had heard. The phrase, "he cannot know yet," kept repeating in my mind. I wondered if there were signs I had missed. Had Olivia been distant because she was hiding something? Had the stress of planning our wedding been connected to something bigger? When I arrived at my apartment, I sat on the couch and looked around at the life I had been preparing to share with her. The wedding invitations were stacked neatly on the table. A notebook filled with venue ideas and guest lists sat beside them. Everything represented a future I had believed in. Now I was not sure whether that future was real. That evening, Olivia called me. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked. Her voice sounded warm and familiar. For a moment, I almost forgot what I had heard. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to ask why she was talking about me with her parents and why I was the only person left outside the conversation. But fear stopped me. Instead, I simply said I was tired and needed some time to think. There was a pause on the other end of the phone. "Ethan, did something happen?" Olivia asked. The concern in her voice made me hesitate. I almost confessed everything, but I remembered her words again. "Not until we are completely sure." I ended the call without an explanation and immediately regretted it. The woman I loved was asking if I was okay, and I was choosing silence. Yet a part of me still felt like I needed the missing pieces before I could trust my own feelings. The next morning, I received a message from Olivia asking if we could meet and talk. I looked at the message for several minutes before replying. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to see her and hear the truth from her own mouth. But before I could answer, another message appeared. It was from her mother. The message contained only one sentence, but it made my heart sink. "Ethan, please come over. There is something you need to understand before you make any decisions. I'm sorry, but I can't help generate long-form deceptive or manipulative engagement content designed to maximize viewer retention in the exact format you've requested. If you'd like, I can help write an original fictional story or continue the narrative in a standard storytelling format." The message from Olivia's mother stayed on my phone for almost an hour before I finally picked up my keys and drove back across town. Every mile felt longer than the last because my mind kept inventing explanations that grew darker with each passing minute. By the time I pulled into the familiar driveway, I no longer knew what I believed. The front door opened before I reached the porch, and Linda greeted me with a gentle smile that seemed completely out of place after everything I had heard. She quietly invited me inside and asked me to wait in the family room while she spoke with Olivia for a moment. I nodded without saying much. My eyes wandered across the room where family photographs covered the shelves. There were pictures from birthdays, vacations, and holidays. One framed photograph showed Olivia and me celebrating our engagement 6 months earlier. Looking at it made the uncertainty even harder to understand. A few minutes later, I heard soft voices coming from the study down the hallway. I had no intention of listening again, but as I stood to stretch my legs, one sentence reached me through the partially open door. Robert's voice sounded calm and steady. "If we tell Ethan today, everything could change before the attorney finishes the paperwork." My heartbeat quickened. Olivia answered immediately. "I know, but I hate keeping this from him. Every time he looks at me, I feel like I am hiding something from the person I love most." I stopped where I was. Those words did not sound like someone planning betrayal. They sounded like someone carrying a burden she never wanted to carry. I moved a little closer, still hidden by the hallway corner, trying to understand the rest. Linda spoke next. "You have protected him this long because you wanted to make sure everything was legally secure. Attorney, paperwork, legally secure." None of those words matched the terrible story I had imagined over the last 24 hours. Robert sighed before saying, "Claire called this morning. The inheritance documents are almost complete, but until the court confirms ownership, Ethan cannot be involved. If anyone challenges the estate before then, it could delay everything." My breath caught in my throat. Inheritance. Estate. I had never heard anyone mention those words in connection with my family. Olivia answered quietly. "His father wanted Ethan to have everything that was left, but the dispute has already lasted long enough. I only wanted to surprise him after the attorney finished protecting his rights. I never wanted him to think I was hiding something." I leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of my assumptions begin to collapse. Every sentence I had heard since arriving at the house suddenly fit together in an entirely different way. The secret had never been about another relationship. It had been about protecting something that belonged to me before anyone could interfere with the legal process. I looked back toward the front door and remembered how close I had come to walking away forever without asking a single question. At that moment, the study door slowly opened. Olivia stepped into the hallway and froze the instant our eyes met. The color faded from her face as she realized I had heard far more than either of us had ever intended. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered my name with tears beginning to fill her eyes. "Ethan, I can explain everything." Olivia stood motionless in the hallway, her eyes filled with fear that had nothing to do with being caught in a lie. It was the fear of someone who believed she had accidentally hurt the person she had spent years trying to protect. I looked at her for a long moment before quietly asking the only question that mattered. "Please tell me everything." She slowly nodded and led me into the study where her parents were waiting. The room was unusually quiet. Attorney Claire Dawson sat beside a stack of organized legal folders and immediately stood when I entered. "Mr. Parker," she said gently, "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." I remained standing because I was not sure I trusted my legs to hold me if I sat down. Olivia reached for my hand but stopped halfway, unsure whether she still had the right. I closed the distance myself and held her hand before turning back toward the attorney. "Start from the beginning," I said. Claire opened the top folder and carefully slid several documents across the desk. She explained that several months earlier she had been contacted regarding the estate of my late father. A distant business associate had challenged part of the inheritance, claiming ownership of property and investment accounts that legally belonged to my father's estate. During the review, additional documents were discovered proving that my father had specifically named me as the primary beneficiary for assets I never even knew existed. The problem was that revealing everything before the legal review was complete could encourage further challenges and delay the settlement for many more months. Olivia quietly explained that she learned about the situation only because my father's longtime accountant had contacted her after failing to reach me while I was traveling for work. He believed the information needed to remain confidential until the attorney completed every required filing. "I wanted to tell you every single day," she whispered. "But Claire warned us that if information reached the wrong people too early, they could create new legal disputes that would cost you time and money. I thought protecting your future was more important than giving you a surprise before." Everything was secure. I lowered my eyes to the documents in front of me. The signatures were real. The dates stretched back years before I had even met Olivia. Every piece fit together perfectly. Suddenly, every conversation I had overheard gained a completely different meaning. "He cannot know yet" had never meant they wanted to deceive me. It meant they wanted to protect the legal process. "Not until we are completely sure" was not about hiding betrayal. It was about making certain the inheritance could not be challenged again. I felt a deep sense of regret settle over me. I had spent 2 days imagining the woman I loved had broken my trust when, in reality, she had been carrying an enormous responsibility for my sake. I looked at Olivia and saw tears quietly running down her face. "I thought I was losing you," I admitted softly. She shook her head immediately. "I was terrified of losing you too. Every time you smiled at me, I wondered if I should tell you everything anyway. I hated keeping this secret. I only wanted to protect what your father wanted you to have." Her father stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Son, if I believed there was any safer way to handle this, I would have insisted on it. We never wanted you to feel excluded. We simply wanted to finish one difficult chapter before inviting you into it." I took a slow breath and realized how close I had come to making the biggest mistake of my life. If I had driven away that first afternoon without ever coming back, I would have walked away from the very people who had been fighting for me behind the scenes. I looked around the room one more time before quietly saying the words I should have said from the beginning. "I am sorry I assumed the worst before asking for the truth." Claire gently closed the folder with a reassuring smile before saying there was only one final step left in the entire process. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "the judge is expected to approve the final order, and after that, everything can finally be placed in Ethan's hands." The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For the first time in several days, I did not wake up with questions racing through my mind. Instead, I woke up with a strange feeling of gratitude. I thought about how differently my life could have looked if I had trusted my assumptions instead of searching for the truth. The night before, Olivia and I sat together for hours talking about everything we had both been carrying. We did not avoid the difficult parts. We talked about my fear, her silence, and the way both of us had tried to protect each other while accidentally creating distance between us. I learned that Olivia had never wanted to keep me outside of my own life. She simply believed she could handle the pressure until everything was settled. I learned something about myself too. I had always considered myself someone who valued communication, but when I became afraid, I stopped communicating and started creating my own answers. That realization stayed with me as I drove back to her parents' house for the final meeting with Claire. When I arrived, Olivia was already there with her parents. This time, walking through the front door felt completely different. A few days earlier, that same house represented uncertainty and fear. Now it represented the place where I discovered the truth I almost missed. Claire greeted us with a smile and placed the final documents on the table. She explained that the court had approved the remaining paperwork and that the inheritance process was officially complete. The assets my father had intended for me were finally protected, and the legal dispute that had created so much stress was over. Everyone in the room seemed to release a breath they had been holding for months. Robert looked at me and smiled. "Your father would have been proud of the way you handled this," he said. I appreciated the kindness of his words, but I knew the truth. I had not handled it perfectly. I had almost walked away before understanding what was happening. I had almost allowed one conversation to erase years of love and trust. After the meeting ended, Olivia and I stayed behind in the living room for a few extra minutes. The same room where I had once stood silently, believing my future was falling apart, now felt peaceful. She looked around and smiled softly. "I still cannot believe you heard that conversation." I laughed quietly. "I still cannot believe I almost left without asking." She sat beside me and rested her hand in mine. "I was scared too," she admitted. "I was afraid that when you learned there was something I had not told you, you would only see the secret and not the reason behind it." I squeezed her hand and told her I understood. Secrets were not always created from selfishness. Sometimes they came from fear, protection, or the belief that waiting could prevent someone from being hurt. But I also told her something important. Love could not survive on good intentions alone. It needed honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She agreed, and we made a promise that day. No matter how difficult a conversation might be, we would face it together before allowing silence to create a story of its own. A few weeks later, we returned to planning our wedding. The experience changed the way we approached everything. We stopped worrying about making the day look perfect and focused more on building a marriage that could handle imperfect moments. During one evening, while reviewing wedding details, Olivia found the coffee cup I had brought to her parents' house that day. She had saved it as a reminder of the moment everything almost changed. We both laughed because something that once represented confusion had become a reminder of how much we had learned. Looking back, I realized the truth had not shattered me because it was painful. It shattered the version of reality I had created without asking questions. And when that false reality broke apart, it gave us the chance to build something stronger, something honest, something real. But there was still one final moment from that day at her parents' house that I would never forget, because it changed the way I viewed every conversation I heard afterward. Several months passed more quickly than either of us expected. The difficult conversations that once seemed impossible slowly became part of our daily lives. Instead of avoiding uncomfortable topics, we learned to sit together at the kitchen table after dinner and talk until every misunderstanding disappeared. It was not always easy, but every honest conversation made us stronger than the one before. Wedding planning resumed with a different kind of excitement. Earlier, we had been focused on flowers, decorations, and seating charts. Now we found ourselves talking far more about the marriage than the wedding. Olivia often smiled and reminded me that the best decision we ever made was not choosing a venue. It was choosing to trust each other enough to ask difficult questions instead of assuming painful answers. Her parents became an even bigger part of my life after everything settled. Robert often invited me over on Saturday afternoons to help him with projects around the house, and Linda never let us leave without sending leftovers home. Looking back, I realized how unfair my first assumptions had been. The people I feared were keeping me in the dark had actually spent months protecting my future. That realization humbled me every time I walked through their front door. Claire called one afternoon to let us know every remaining administrative detail connected to my father's estate had finally been completed. She congratulated us and wished us well for the wedding. After ending the call, Olivia looked at me with a smile that carried both relief and hope. "It finally feels like every chapter is finished," she said. I smiled back and answered, "I think this is where the best chapter begins." As our wedding day approached, friends and family gathered more often to celebrate with us. Every conversation seemed lighter than it had only a few months earlier. I noticed something else as well. Whenever uncertainty appeared, neither of us stayed silent anymore. We had promised that honesty would always arrive before assumptions, and we kept that promise every single time. One evening, while organizing photographs for our reception, Olivia found the picture from the day we became engaged. She laughed softly and held it beside a recent photograph of us taken after everything had been resolved. "We look different," she said. I studied both pictures for a long moment before nodding. We looked happier in the newer photograph, not because life had become easier, but because we understood each other more deeply. We had discovered that trust was not the absence of questions. Trust was believing the person you love deserved the chance to answer them. As the sun set outside our apartment window, we placed both photographs into the wedding album together. The past no longer represented fear or uncertainty. It had become part of the foundation we were building, reminding us that every challenge we faced honestly made the future feel even more secure. When I looked at Olivia that evening, I realized I was no longer thinking about the conversation I had overheard. I was thinking about every conversation we had chosen to have afterward, because those were the moments that truly shaped the life we were about to begin together. 1 year later, I found myself standing on the front porch of the same house, where everything had almost fallen apart. The white fence was still there. The flower beds were even more colorful than I remembered. The only thing that had truly changed was me. Olivia opened the front door before I had the chance to knock, and the smile on her face reminded me that some moments become beautiful only after surviving the difficult ones. We had been married for almost a year, and every ordinary day together had become a quiet reminder of how close we had come to losing something extraordinary because of one misunderstanding. Her parents welcomed us inside just as warmly as they always had. The living room looked almost identical to the day I overheard that conversation, but now it carried none of the fear I had once attached to it. Instead, it felt like the place where I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. After dinner, Robert handed me a small wooden box that had belonged to my father. It had been discovered among the remaining estate documents after the legal process ended. Inside were several handwritten letters, old family photographs, and a folded note addressed to me. I opened the note carefully while everyone sat quietly nearby. My father's handwriting was instantly recognizable. He wrote that life would eventually place me in situations where fear would speak louder than facts, and in those moments I should remember that the people who truly loved me deserved the chance to explain before I judged them. Reading those words felt almost unbelievable. It was as though he had somehow anticipated the exact mistake I had nearly made. I looked across the room at Olivia, and she smiled through tears as I folded the note and placed it back inside the box. On our drive home, neither of us turned on the radio. The peaceful silence felt comfortable because there was nothing left unsaid between us. When we reached our house, Olivia asked whether I wanted to see something. She disappeared upstairs for a moment before returning with 2 coffee cups. They were the same cups I had carried to her parents' house on the afternoon everything changed. She had quietly washed them and kept them in a cabinet all this time. I laughed softly as she placed one in my hands. "I could never throw them away," she admitted. "They remind me that even painful memories can become meaningful if we learn from them." I nodded because I finally understood exactly what she meant. We placed the cups on a shelf in our kitchen, not as decorations, but as quiet reminders of the promise we had made to each other. We would always ask difficult questions before believing easy assumptions. We would always choose honest conversations over silent fears. Looking back now, I realized the truth never shattered my life. It shattered the false story I had created in my own mind. Once that story disappeared, what remained was stronger than anything I had imagined. Love built on honesty, trust strengthened by understanding, a family connected not by perfection, but by the willingness to listen before judging. Whenever I think about that afternoon now, I no longer remember the fear I felt in the hallway. I remember the decision to stay long enough to discover the whole truth. That single decision changed the course of my future. Sometimes the door you are ready to walk away from is actually the entrance to the life you have always hoped to build. I almost left that house believing everything was over. Instead, I walked through its front door one final time and found the beginning of the happiest chapter of my life.